Welcome to the services of Old Hickory Baptist Church. We're glad to have you with us today, visiting by way of YouTube and Facebook. We're happy to have you and hope that when things get back to normal, that you'll come and visit us in person. We'd love to have you sit in the congregation. It would be a joy for us to get together once again. Okay, at this time, we're going to start with a song by Bob Blacksher.
Soon I shall hear the call from heaven's portal. Come home, my child, it's the last mile you must drive. I'll fall asleep and wake in God's sweet heaven. For I'm sheltered in the arms of God. So let the storms reach high, the dark clouds rise. They don't worry me, for I'm sheltered safe within the arms of God. He walks with me, and not on earth shall harm me. For I'm sheltered in the arms of God. For I'm sheltered in the arms of God.
I have a few announcements that I need to make. If you can keep up with the Sunday school lessons from your quarterly by going to Baptist Publishing House Facebook page at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and the lesson will be taught for you. It's a very good lesson. I don't know who it is that's teaching, but he did a great job last week. Another thing that's of vital importance to the church is that we remember that the expenses of the church continue even during a difficult time like this. So I encourage each one to send your tithes, your offerings to Old Hickory Baptist Church, Post Office Box 88, Hattieville 72063, and that'll help us be able to continue our ministry. Also, the months of March and April are special emphasis months for the Baptist trumpet, and if you have a special offering for that, just indicate that on your check, and we'll see to it that the trumpet gets that offering. And Linda and I would like to thank everybody that's called us to check on us to see how we were doing. We appreciate it so very much. And the answer is we're doing very, very well. Maybe getting a little bit stir crazy, but I think we're going to make it. We'll do fine. And at this time, we have a quartet to sing for us. Michelle Robinson, Annette Williams, and Bob Blacksher.
In shady green pastures, so rich and so sweet, God leads his dear children along. Where the waters cool flow bathes the weary one's feet, God leads his dear children along. Some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. Through sorrow befall us and Satan oppose, God leads his dear children along. Through grace we can conquer, defeat all our foes. God leads his dear children along. Some through the waters, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood. Some through great sorrow, but God gives a song in the night season and all the day long.
This morning, we're reading from Genesis 39, verses 20 through 23, and the topic is responding to the prisons of life. In Genesis 39, verse 20, we read, "And Joseph's master took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." A few months ago, I preached a series on the life of Joseph. He may be my favorite Bible character outside of Jesus himself. But you can find some remarkable stories when you look through the life of Jesus. And here, as we look at his life, we find that there is a mixture of sadness and glory, and of success and of pain. He has been the lowest of the low and lifted to the highest of the high. And as a result of the things that happened in Joseph's life, I think we can learn a lot of lessons that we can apply to believers in our age. And that one of those lessons is found in this passage that I just read in your hearing. In this passage, Joseph is in one of the very lowest moments of his young life. He's a young man. He's been sold into slavery by his brothers, and there in Egypt, a man named Potiphar buys him and as a slave. And Joseph is a godly man, and Potiphar recognizes the worth of this young man, so he elevates him and puts him over in charge of his whole household. But Potiphar's wife had eyes for Joseph, and she tried to get Joseph to commit adultery with her, and he ran and left his coat as he was running away from her. That's the second time, if you remember from Scripture, that Joseph's coat had got him into trouble. First time, his brothers were jealous of his coat, and that's one of the things that caused them to sell him as a slave. And the second time, now here's with Potiphar's wife. And because Joseph spurned her advances, she went and told her husband that he had tried to rape her. He got angry. He threw Joseph into prison. And there in the prison, the keeper of the prison recognized that he was an upright and godly individual and elevated him to keeper of the prison. He gave him charge of the entire prison, and Joseph ran that prison while he was in there. But there in that prison, but remember, in that prison, even though Joseph had responsibilities, he was nevertheless a prisoner. And there in that prison, Joseph learned some very valuable lessons. He learned some things about the Lord that served him throughout his entire life that he would not have known had he not been placed in that prison. But realize this, when Joseph was in that prison, he wasn't alone in that prison experience. And there are a lot of great men in the Bible. If you study through the Bible, you'll find that many of the great men of the Bible found themselves in prison. Samson did, Daniel did, Jeremiah did, Hosea, John the Baptist, Peter and John, Paul and Silas. Just so many great men serving the Lord found themselves in a prison. So many of God's greatest servants had to go through a prison experience from time to time. And in each of these prisons, the Lord revealed his power and his providence on behalf of his servants. So what does that all mean to us? Well, every one of us are going to find us in prisons from time to time. And I'm not talking about necessarily being locked up and put behind bars, but situations in our life where we just feel like the whole world is closing in on us, that we don't know how to cope. It's out of our control. Trials, troubles on every hand, those kinds of prisons. Those troubles, I think we can compare to a prison experience, because they can certainly cause great problems in our lives. But on the flip side of that coin, they can also cause us to learn many important truths about our great God. I just want you to know that the prisons of life don't have to defeat you. It's my conviction that God leads us into these prison experiences that we have so often in life, so that we might recognize his work and his glory, so that we might really see it. So I'd like for us to take a few moments just to learn some things about a prison experience from the account of Joseph. There's some truths that I think can be taught here that we need to grasp. One thing we notice, prison isn't a fun place. It's an oppressive place. It's a difficult place. It says that Joseph was bound in prison, so we know that this was not a pleasant thing. He has lost his liberty, and he was placed there against his will. And you remember the dream he had back in Genesis 37, where he had dreamed about the sheaves in the field, and the sheaves bowing down to his sheaf, and then the dream of the sun, moon, and the stars, where the sun, moon, and the stars bowed down before him. Well, what was going on in the prison was a far cry from the things that that Joseph had anticipated in that dreams all those many years before. This was a tough place. It was harsh. There was suffering. Joseph's life was not going well at this time, and things like that happen in our experience as well. There are times when it just seems like the bottom falls out of our lives, that everything has left us. That's pretty much the experience of Job, and it's going to be the experience of every other person that lives in this world. Let me assure you, if you're not going through troubles at this time, you will be going through troubles after a short while. In Job chapter 14 and verse 1, it says, "Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble." And then in Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 23, it says, "For all his days are sorrows, and his travail grief, yea, his heart taketh not rest in the night. This also is vanity." We all feel those experiences, But we're all going to go through them at one time or another. We don't ever have any fun as we're going through those experiences, but they are a part of every single person's life. No one is exempt from difficult times in life. But Joseph was now in prison, but there in that prison, he was going to learn a very powerful lesson that when a person's life is lined up with the will of God, he's abundantly free, even though he may be enclosed behind prison bars. And many of us, with the epidemic that's sweeping, the pandemic that's sweeping our nation, and are being confined to the home, feel like we're kind of in a prison. What does the future hold? Is there a future? And certainly there is a future because there's a great God. But we feel the uncertainty, we feel the panic in that situation. Be still, God says, and know that I am God. We can learn some lessons during this time that we're walking through. There's a difference between the children of God and all the rest of the world. While the rest of the world is struggling through their difficulties, the child of God can rest assured that in the knowledge of God, that God has them where they are for His own purposes. And if we're walking in His ways, He'll bless us where we are, despite the fact that we might feel like we're in prison at that moment. In Job chapter 23 and 10 we read, and listen to Job. Now you know the things that Job went through. We're not going through anything like that at this moment. Job said, He knoweth the way that I take. When He hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. I want to make a little aside here, if I might. If you're feeling like your world is coming apart right now, I suggest a Bible study for you. I suggest that you go and do a detailed study of Job, the life of Job, the response of Job. I think it'll be a blessing to you if you would do that. So I encourage you, if you feel like your world has fallen apart, study the book of Job. The song that was sung earlier, God leads us along. It says, sometimes on the mount where the sun shines so bright, God leads His dear children along. Sometimes in the valley in darkest of night, God leads His dear children along. Some through the water, some through the flood, some through the fire, but all through the blood. But God gives a song in the night season and all the day long. That's what we need to learn today. That no matter where we are not separated from God. No matter what we're under at this very moment, God is still leading His dear children along. He's promised to do that. This was the idea behind the 23rd Psalm that David wrote. When he said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He leadeth me and maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Isn't that a beautiful song? What if you look at that song? That takes in the entirety of life. God's with us in the robustness of life. He's with us in the twilight years of our life, and He's with us for eternity. God is always with His children. And I can assure you that God knows what He's doing. I can be oppressed by what's going on in my life, but also be blessed by the author of life, because He is leading me where He would have me to go. Joseph, who was going to rise to be prime minister of Egypt, was a nobody. He's one of the prisoners of the king. He's been sold into slavery by his brothers, locked up in prison, and it's probably seemed to him that all those dreams he had in the past have been dashed to pieces, that they didn't mean anything at all. He had dreamed that God was going to make something special out of his life. But here he is. He's going absolutely nowhere. a prisoner. He's got no future, it seems. It must have felt like to Joseph like God had forgotten about him. And he must have felt alone, deserted, defeated. How else could he feel thereby what he was going through? The things, troubles, the temptations, the trials that he was facing at that time. But the prisons of our life can cause all of us to feel that way. Whenever these problems begin to pile up and mount up against us, it's easy to feel like, well, maybe the Lord has deserted us. He doesn't care anymore. We tend to feel forgotten, overlooked by the Lord. And the devil uses those times. He likes times like that in our lives so he can come up and say, well, if God really cared about you, why would he be putting you through all of this that you're going through? Or you trusted God. What did he get you? Nothing but trouble. And if you happen to be feeling that way today, let me remind you of something. Very important that we remember this. God cares. Others may forget about us, but God knows exactly where I am, and he knows exactly what I'm facing. In fact, I have his promise about this. In Luke chapter 12, verses 6 and 7, we read, "Are not 5 sparrows sold for a farthing, and not one of them is forgotten before God? But even the very hairs of your head are numbered. Fear not, therefore, ye are more valued than many sparrows." And then one of my favorite verses in Hebrews 4 and 15, it says, "For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin." Whenever we face those lonely, empty times of life, whenever it seems that God has forgotten all about us, just remember, you're not the first one to feel this way, nor are you going to be the last one to feel this way. That even great men of God have felt that way before. You remember Elijah, he'd gone up to Mount Carmel, he'd had his encounter with the 400 prophets of Baal, and completely overwhelmed them. They built the altars and they put the sacrifice on. The prophets of Baal prayed all day long and they cut themselves and cried. And Elijah would say, prodding them a little bit, said, "Maybe your God's asleep or he's taking a trip. Maybe you'll yell louder." And they would get louder and louder. And then finally it became Elijah's turn. It was Elijah's turn. And he says, "Pour water on it and put some more water on it, put some more water on it. Just soak that altar down." And he prayed a prayer. And God sent fire and consumed the offering. He consumed the water. He consumed the whole altar. And you'd think, my, what a mountaintop experience he was having. And then we realize that he felt, Jezebel said, "Let me tell you something, Elijah. You're going to be like one of the prophets. I'm going to kill you." So he took off running away from, he'd faced the 400 priests, but he took off running from one woman. And we find him under a juniper tree feeling sorry for himself, saying, "Lord, let me die. I'm the only one left. Just let me die." And God spoke to him, cared for him, nurtured him. And he says, "I've got many other prophets that have been protected. You're not the only one. Quit feeling sorry for yourself." God knew where Elijah was, and God came to him, spoke to him, and used him for his glory. And he knows where you are. That to me is an important truth. Never forget the truth that God knows where we are. He knows what prison you're going through. And the bottom line is, he holds the key to your freedom. He is the one that unlocks that door. You may be in an obscure place where nobody notices, but God knows. He'll bring you out for his glory. The hardest thing we have to do is to submit to him even when we don't like where we are. And then we notice that Joseph was given an opportunity there. He had the privilege of learning some things about God, some valuable lessons about God. He learned about God's presence and his providence and his purposes and God's power. He learned lessons that he could not have learned under more pleasant conditions. One of the great blessings of going through trials of life is what we learn about God. The trials of life teach us things about God that we would not learn under any other circumstance. We can only learn it when we are in the fire or in the prison. Think about it. Daniel would never have known that God had power over lions if he hadn't been thrown in the lion's den. The Hebrew children wouldn't know that God had power over the furnace if they had not been thrown into the fiery furnace. The disciples would never have known that God had power over the sea and the storm if they had not been in that little boat being tossed around on the lake Gennesaret out there. Mary and Martha would not have learned that Jesus is the resurrection and the life if their brother Lazarus had not died. That great crowd of people would not have known the power of God to multiply food, loaves and fishes, if they had not been in a wilderness place, hungry, with no place to buy food. They would never have known that. The woman with the bloody issue would have not known the healing power of Christ without the suffering that she had gone through, and had not paid the cost for her illness. And you can go on with these things, but we learn more about him in difficult times than we do in good times. Whenever we go through the prisons of life, we learn that he's with us. We learn that he's able to sustain us. We learn that he's greater than any problem that we might be going through. And we learn that God does have a plan for our lives. He's not left us here to find our own way. We learn that the prisons of life are not designed to stop us. They're designed to strengthen us, to make us more than what we were before. Even in the midst of the difficulty that Joseph was going through, he was being blessed and used by the Lord. God's hand is very much evident in the life of Joseph. If we could really grasp hold of the fact that our prisons that we're going through are really opportunities provided for us by the Lord, we would never, when in a prison, ask why. Whenever we're there, we wouldn't be saying, why, Lord? Why do you let this happen? He has a reason for it. But we would instead realize that God is working out his divine plan and purpose for our lives. And we ought to learn to ask, what, Lord, are you planning for me? Because we would know beyond a doubt that God was doing something good for us. And another thing we notice about Joseph in that prison is that he was very obedient to God. He remained faithful. No matter what was happening in his life, he remained faithful. You know how Joseph viewed the prison? Another place where I can serve the Lord. That's the way he looked at it, just another place of service. That tells us a lot about Joseph. He was a man of integrity. He was going to remain faithful to the Lord no matter what the circumstance of his life might be at any given time. He was going to be faithful. Even in the prison experience, we don't find Joseph sitting in his cell whining and saying, oh, poor me, poor me. As Joseph, he was living for the Lord regardless of where he was, doing his very best to be a man of integrity, even when nothing was going his way. We could learn a lesson from Joseph. I can tell you that it's God's will not to put you in a beautiful cultivated garden. He wants you to bloom wherever you happen to be. If you're in a place of despair, bloom there. If you happen to be in a place of blessing, bloom there. Just wherever you are, you do what God would want you to do. Regardless of your circumstances, regardless of your problems, and you may have all kinds of them in your life right at this very moment. God expects you to be faithful to him. God expects you in all situations to serve him diligently. We owe that to him because he has given his all for us. But there are people that want to back out on the Lord. They say, well, I can't get my family interested in God, so I just can't do it by myself. I just might as well quit. Or they'll say, well, you just don't really understand, preacher, what I'm facing. I have this problem, that circumstance. That's what's hindering me from serving the Lord. You know what those are? those are just foolish statements. They're cop-outs. They really have no value making them. Do you realize that each of us, and underline this now in your mind, each of us serves God to the degree that we choose. Each of us serves God to the degree that we choose. That's how much we serve the Lord. We can either choose to be faithful in spite of what we're going through, or we can choose to throw up our hands and quit and derail God's work in our lives. That's a choice that we have to make. But with the Lord's help, we can learn the truth that God has us exactly where we are for our good and for His glory. We can either honor God by a life of obedience, no matter what we're going through, or we can dishonor Him by allowing trials to hinder our service for Him. That's a choice we make. So I would like to challenge each of you to remember that nothing just happens. There is no such thing as a coincidence. God is either in absolute control or He is not in control at all. That's the bottom line. But the Bible teaches us that we serve a sovereign God. What does it mean to be sovereign? In Psalm 50 verses 10 and 12 we read, "For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell thee, for the world is mine, and the fullness thereof." And then in Psalm 115:3, "But our God is in the heavens. He hath done whatsoever He hath pleased." That's what it means to be sovereign. God does whatever He pleases. He is in total control. So that's what the way it is. Absolute control of everything that's in your life, even what you're going through at this moment. I think the whole idea of this is summed up in the word faithfulness. God's desire for each of us is that we be faithful to Him and His will every minute of every hour, of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year, of every decade, of every century. He expects us to give our all to Him and be faithful in everything at all times, regardless of what we're going through. Nothing is an excuse for not serving the Lord. Nothing can happen in your life unless God allows it. So you can either serve Him in obedience and faithfulness, or you can deny His work in your life and rebel against Him. But either way, it doesn't change the fact that God has us where we are so that His light may be seen by a lost and dying world. Matthew 5, Jesus says, "You are the light of the world." Make sure your light shine. It's on a candlestick so the world can see it. God has us to shine in this world. So we find Joseph, he stayed in prison 2.5 years, probably, from the time Potiphar threw him in there till he was taken out of prison. And I don't know exactly how long, but I know it was at least a couple of years. And while he was there, God used him greatly. We read in Genesis chapter 40 and 41 about the butler and the baker and the dreams that they had in prison. They'd been thrown in prison, they had dreams, and he interpreted their dreams. And because the prisoners saw that there was something in Joseph that they could come to him for advice and for leadership. And so here we find this happening in Joseph's life. But from that prison, in just a matter of, I don't know how long would you think it'd take Joseph from being released from prison, going and cleaning up the Bible tells us that he went and freshened himself up, put on clean clothes, but before he went before Pharaoh, maybe an hour. He went from being a prisoner to being prime minister in less than an hour. Isn't that amazing? The prison was a place of overcoming. Because of his faithfulness there in that prison, he was called forth from the prison and elevated to number 2 position in the land of Egypt. We need to understand that the Lord uses trials, or used the trials that Joseph was going through to get him ready for the service that he had planned for him in the future. God puts you in the prison at the proper time for the proper purpose in order to prepare you for what he has ahead. Through the trials that Joseph went through, he had compassion on others. He learned administrative skills. He learned obedience. He was faithful. Notice how Joseph increased in his responsibilities. In Genesis chapter 37, he's given an assignment. His daddy said, Joseph, go check on your brothers, see how they're doing. And we know how that turned out. They threw him in a pit and then sold him to these merchants and carried him off to Egypt. So the next place we find he's been bought as a slave, and he's given another assignment. He's placed over a household. Now Potiphar was a very rich man. He had lots and lots of money. And so Joseph was in charge of everything that Potiphar had. But then he winds up thrown in prison because of Potiphar's wife. And so when they're in the prison, he's given another assignment. Because of his faithfulness, he's placed over the prison. He's in charge of everything that goes on in that prison. And he remained faithful through all of this in standing for the Lord, in interpreting these dreams. And ultimately, we find he's placed over a nation, the nation of Egypt. He was in control of everything that was going on in the land of Egypt. God used prison as Joseph's proving ground. He learned everything he needed to learn to be able to flourish as leader of Egypt. So as we pass through these prisons of life that we go through, realize that God's just training us. And when we're found faithful, as we're going through the valley, then we are allowed to experience even greater levels of authority and blessing. God uses the difficulties in life to grow us so that we might use our lives in a more wonderful way than would have been otherwise possible. Listen to Luke chapter 16, verse 10. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much. God's getting us ready for something great. And I can't help but believe that through this coronavirus, God is getting many, many, many Christians, he's opening their eyes and getting them ready for something great. I cannot help but feel a revival coming in our nation. I pray that that's so. So we need to learn to not rebel against the prisons in our life. We need to learn to yield to the Lord's work in our lives. We need to learn to trust him and let him have his way in us and through us. He knows where he wants us, and he knows what he would have us to do. Let's learn to trust him and experience the very best he has to offer. So if you're a friend, if you're in a prison this day, or even if you're not, you're going to be, so this is pertinent for everybody, you need the lesson that Joseph has taught us today. So look deeply in your heart, see if you're in that place of alignment with God's plans and purposes for your life. Are you a Christian who is blooming where God planted you? Or do you find yourself rebelling and struggling against the prison that's holding you? Whatever the need, there's hope and there's help in our glorious God today. Thank you for being with us this morning, and we appreciate the time that you spent with us.